Welcome to Declaring and Creating Arrays. In this lecture, we'll be understanding what an array is. We'll be looking at how we declare and create arrays, and that will be very similar to how we've declared and created variables. We'll be taking a look at the array initializer. We'll be passing arrays to methods, and we'll look at understand the flexibility of an array. And then we'll finish off by actually using an array in a programming environment. So let's start off by understanding what an array actually is. An array is a group of variables of the same type. So basically it can be a group of integers, it can be a group of doubles, it can be a group of booleans, anything like that. And it can be a group of objects, anything. And an array itself is an object. So an array itself is an object, just like a string itself is an object, an array is an object. And an array can contain primitive or reference types. So, the array can be made up of a group of integers. An array can be made up of a group of strings. Remember, strings are objects. And all of these integers, strings, or whatever is within an array, they're known as variables. And all of the elements of an array are of the same type. So the variables of an array are known as the elements, and all of these elements have to be of the same type. And the first element, or the first one in the group, has the index 0. So the index value is 0. Now remember that computer science, it starts off by counting. It starts off counting with 0. So what you would think would be first would actually be 0. And what you would think would be second would be first. So that's something to keep in mind as we look at arrays. So now let's understand how to declare and create an array. So let's look at the first declaration, which is int and then two brackets, a equals new int bracket 10 bracket semicolon. So what we're doing is we've created an array named a, and it contains 10 integers. Now how do we know this? Well, the first thing we do is we go int bracket bracket. So what this does is this tells us the type of this variable is an integer array, and then a is the name of the array. The new keyword is often used. We've seen when we're declaring objects, we've used the new keyword with arrays as well. Not with arrays. We've used the new keyword with strings as well, and scanners and everything. Whenever we've been declaring objects, we've been using the new keyword. And then we have int bracket 10 bracket. So what this does is that we're creating a new int array, and it contains 10 integers. So the 10 signifies how many integers it contains. Let's look at another example, int brackets c. Now what this does is that this simply declares a array variable which has a name of c, and it doesn't set it doesn't initialize it. It doesn't give it a limit of how many elements it contains. Later in the program, I could say c equals new int 10. So this will basically establish c to be an integer array with 10 integers. And then similarly, let's say that I'm not really looking for an array containing integers as elements. Let's say I want an array that contains strings as elements. So similarly, I could go string brackets b equals new string bracket 20 bracket. So basically everywhere I've replaced int with string, and this is what it does is now that we're creating a string array, and this has 20 elements and 20 strings because it's a new string with 20 elements, as you can tell by the declaration. And originally when you initialize, now we have let's say that we have the array a, and it contains 10 integers. Now what would the value of these integers be? We haven't really defined it. So for any numerical value that's just initialized within an array but we haven't given a specific value, it's automatically assumed that its value is 0. Similarly, if we were to create a Boolean array and we have multiple Boolean values, all of them would defaultly have a value of false. And similarly, if we use reference types like objects, then it would be null. So since string is an object, all of the strings within string array B would have a value of null. Now, let's take a look at the array initializer, which is another way of declaring and creating arrays. So I could go int brackets c equals in braces 2, 45, 34, 56, 76, and so on. And these are 10 different elements, and they're contained within braces. So rather than going int bracket c equals new int brace 10 brace, what we're doing here is we're basically saying that we're automatically setting the values. So as you can see, within the braces there are 10 different values, and that basically all of these, this is a group of int variables, and that's what the C integer array represents. And this C integer array contains all of these values in this specific order. So this is another way of declaring a variable, of array. So basically we've declared an array of named C, and we've assigned it 10 elements, and all of these elements are of integer type. So now if I were to go C bracket O bracket, now what this does is that this is C bracket O bracket is equivalent to 2. And why, you might ask? So remember that in programming, counting starts with the number 0. So if we look at the first element, or I should say 0th, but the first element in the array C array, and that is the number 2. Now it has an index of 0, because remember, programming starts by counting with 0. So if we were to find the 0th element of C, that would be equal to 2. If we were to find the 4th element of C, that would equal 76. And why? Because the 0th element is 2, the first element is 45, the second element is 34, the third element is 76, and the fourth element is 76. Similarly, if we wanted to find C of 9, we would go this way. The 0th element is 2, the first element is 45, the second element is 34, the third element, is 56, the fourth element is 76, the fifth element is 33, the sixth element is 65, the seventh element is 67, the eighth element is 78, and finally the ninth element is 9. And we know that we're looking for the ninth element because that's the number between the brackets. And then again we have C, and we're getting the fifth element this time. So this time, in this case, the fifth element is 33. And similarly, this is an easy way to initialize, or basically create, an array and automatically assign it values. Now, an array can be passed as a parameter to a method, and we can use it in different, we can have it as a parameter to a method, and these arrays that are used as parameters can be modified. So originally when let's say we give an integer as a method, that integer is not going to be modified at the end of the day, but we can actually modify arrays, and later in this lecture I'll be showing you some examples where you can see how that works. So now, what are the advantages of an array? Why would people want to use it in an array? And first of all, arrays are really simple. It's just a list of variables. That's how you should think of it. And arrays can be used as class variables. They can be used as objects. They can be used for lists if you want to have a big list, which is something you often have when you're creating a program. And when you want to model things like a deck of cards or anything like that, arrays come in really useful when you have a group of the same thing. And there's a lot of ways to use them, and they become very useful. So now, without further ado, let's move to Dr. Java, where we'll be taking a look at some of the potential ways to declare and create an array. Okay, so here we are at Dr. Java, and we have a program ready called array test. So I have the class declared and the main method declared, and now we're going to start off by declaring our first array. So I'm going to go int, like this, C. So now what have we done till this point? We've told the computer that we're going to have an integer type array. This array is going to have a name of C, and it's going to contain integer variables. Now, at no point does the computer know how many they will be or what type of what value they will have. But the computer does know that we're declaring a C integer array. And now let's use the classic way of declaring an array. So we'll go new int, and then in the brackets I'll say maybe 3. So now what this tells the computer is that our array, our integer array, will have 3 elements. So now I'll go, let's say C0 equals, let's say 1. So now what we're doing here is we are basically giving the 0th element, aka the first element of this array, a value of 1. Now let's give the second element, or the first in computer science terms, a value of 3. And let's give the last element, which is of index 2, a value of 5. So now what we've done is we've given all 3 elements within this integer array a value. And remember that originally when this array was declared, before we give each element a value, each element would automatically have a value of 1. So now let's print out all of these different elements that we've defined and see whether that's working. So let's go let's just print them out one by one. So let's go C, 0. Let's print them out on separate lines to make it easier to distinguish them. So right here I'm gonna copy this a couple of times so that we can print it out here and here. Now let's change this to a 1 and this to a 2. Now let's compile the program and let's run. As you can see, it prints out 1, 3, and 5. Now if I were to change this to a 4 and we compile again, it would print out 1, 4, and 5. So simply this is the way, as you can see, C bracket 0 bracket, whatever integer is within the brackets is the number of the index number of the element accessed. So 0 will access the 0th element, 1 will access the first element, and that's how you can access any of these elements using this notation. And keep in mind that C is the name of the array. So if whatever the name of this will be, if you want to access the 0th element of this array, you'll have to change the name of C to whatever the new name of the array is. Now let's use an array initializer. So let's say that this is complicated. I don't want to name every single element one by one. So what I'll do is I'll start with braces. We'll use an array initializer. And let's give it a couple values. Let's say, let's go with 1, 3, 5, 6. Okay? So now what we have is we have an integer array named C, and it contains 4 elements, 1, 3, 5, and 6. Notice how these different elements are separated by commas. And now let's say that we just want to print out one of these. Elements. So let's say that we want to print out the second or the first element. So we'd go C1. So now what this should print out is this should print out the first element. Not this one, but this one. This is the first. This is the 0th element. This is the first element. So we want to print out the first element. So the computer should print out 3. Let's compile and see if that happens. As you can see, 3 is printed out. Similarly, if I were to wanted to print out the second element, now 5 would be printed out. So let me compile and let me run. And as you can see, 5 is printed out right over here. Now, the last thing that we're going to be taking a look at is something that I briefly went over in the lecture, which is modifying arrays and methods. So I'm here, I'm going to go and I'm going to go past the main method body, and now I'm going to declare a new method. Public static void change. So we want to take so here I'm just going to type this declaration up and then we'll look at it. So what we're doing here is we've declared a new method, public static void change. So public, it's accessible, static, which means that we can access this method inside of the program, which is something we need for testing purposes. So in order to run this method in the main method, we'll need to make it static. Void, because it's not going to return anything. Change is the name of the method, and the parameter is int and then bracket C. So we can change C to anything. That's just what we're going to refer to it as. Let's change it to array. So here we go. This is our declaration for a method called change, which is static, and it takes in one parameter, which is an integer array. So what we're going to do with this integer parameter is we're going to take the array, whatever array it is, whatever integer array it is, and we're going to access the second element and give it a value of 100. So what we've done is basically we're going to take an array, integer array as a parameter, and we're going to set its second element to a value of 100. So let's do it right here. After we print out what the original value of this is, we'll go change, And notice that, remember that we can access this method inside of this class simply because it has the static keyword right here. And let's say we're going to go C. Now what this does is that we'll be changing C, and the reason we put C between the parentheses is because that's our argument, because the change method requires a parameter of an integer array, and C is an int array. So now after this, now that once this change will happen, we're going to reprint it out, and we're going to see if the second element of C changes or not. Let's do it. Compile and let's run. Now as you can see, the second element of C was printed out twice. Once before the change method, and then again after the change method was run. So the first time it printed out 5, which is exactly how we had defined it as. The second time, after the change method was executed, it printed 100. The reason it printed 100 was after we invoked the change method, it basically did C, or array, C, the second element of C is equal to 100. So now this is automatically equal to 100. So now when this was printed out, this was equal to 100. And what this basically aims to show you is that an array can be modified when another program is called. And that's something that we usually haven't looked at yet, but that's something that another thing you can often use for arrays. And sometimes programmers unintentionally modify arrays when they're not attempting to. So that's something else you should keep note of. And a copy of an array is not created. Like with primitive types, when you try to edit them in a method, it doesn't affect their actual value in the program because a copy of the primitive type is created. But with arrays, a copy is not created, so the array is directly affected and changed. So that's something important. So in this lecture, we've looked at declaring and creating arrays, which are very, very important to programming. We've used declaring them 2 different ways, and we've seen their different uses.